Okay, here we go.
Here we go.
All right. How am I gonna segue into the main bit? Should I say like Amy, welcome to S&D Poetry Conversations?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Amy, so we're going to be answering some questions sent in by some of our people from Instagram. We'll start out with some basic ones, and we'll fold in the more difficult questions later. But starting off with a good one, who are some of your favorite poets? What are you reading right now? What's getting you really excited?
That's a really good question. I think there's like kind of two questions in that. First one, I'm gonna answer is one of my favorite poets. Number one, I think it's got to be Frank O'Hara. Kind of anyone from the New York School of Poetry. Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery. That's also a really good one. They're really fun. They're always a good read. I think they play a lot around with linguistics and like semantics. Another poet that I absolutely love is James Merrill. He did The Black Swan. He also did one of my favorite poems, Christmas Tree, which was kind of like an ode to himself as he was dying of AIDS, and it's shaped like a Christmas tree, and it's extremely beautiful. It's a really tender poem.
Right. Oh yes, I remember that one. Very kind of like it's like a concrete poetry type deal.
Yeah, yeah. And normally, I think concrete poetry can be a bit too on the nose, and I think that it kind of cheapens it a little bit. But for some, I think the poem is called Christmas Tree, and it's shaped like a Christmas tree, but it's not about it. The Christmas tree is the center of this image, where he himself is sat basking in the light of it, as he knows that he's dying, but he's basking in the warmth of the Christmas tree and the love of the family that's around him. And I think because it's the image, but it's not the poem itself, if that makes sense. I think that's the best concrete poem I've ever read. It's really beautiful. That's definitely another one. I think recently I've been reading a lot of Mary Oliver.
I saw anybody that follows you on Instagram, you just posted some of her, didn't you?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time with her work, I think, and it's like especially the stuff that I've been reading recently it's a different side. Mary Oliver is one of those poets because she's so, I guess, embedded into the American cultural psyche of poetry. Kind of, she's just one of the most well-known ones, and so everyone kind of knows her work, but at the same time, not really interacting with it enough to kind of get it. And it was the first time I've actually spent time with her work, and not just Wild Geese and her kind of soft nature poetry. Like her erotic work. The side that I don't think people really know about. In the same way, I guess, I don't know, there's kind of slightly erotic work that Emily Dickinson did that people don't focus on as much. It's different. That's been extremely invigorating, especially since I haven't written anything over this lockdown. This has been an extremely, I've been creatively bereft, and I think that's the case for a lot of writers, or for a lot of people who kind of had to. I mean, it's been. I think for some people they've done amazing well writing from this. For a lot of people I know, myself included, it's been really hard. So reading Mary Oliver and the way that she wraps up like this innate femininity without it kind of resorting to like stereotypes of womanhood. It's real fleshed out characters talking about their intimacy, but it still involves nature and how the two interact. Really, it's masterful. That's been quite energizing, and that's made me want to write again.
Oh, good. That's very exciting. Do you have a poem by her that you would recommend for somebody wanting to get a little deeper into Mary Oliver?
I think the one that you've seen the gardens. I think that in itself is a really, really good one. Let me just find it. I think the way she writes, I think, is quite accessible. But can I read a bit out from it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So one part of it, the second section starts, this skin you wear so neatly, in which you settle so brightly on the summer grass, how shall I know it? You gleam as you lie back, breathing like something taken from water, a sea creature, except for your two human legs which tremble and open into the dark country I keep dreaming of. Like that, and it's like that, it's that kind of, that little nugget is the center of the poem, and it's very evocative and it's very richly image laden, but it's like a lot of the times with, I guess, erotic poetry, it's really hard to discern what each image is. But that just kind of lays it bare, and it's not too much.
That's what I was going to say. It's very rich, and I don't know the poem as well as you do, so I don't know where it goes, but just that little section, I imagined like where it goes in either direction. It kind of laid out the rest of the poem for me, and I want to go on that journey.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's kind of the way Mary Oliver is using intimacy there, and it's kind of part of the poem. It doesn't drive the poem exactly, but it's such a key component of it, and it's kind of the narrator, I guess it seems almost like a dream sequence. Things aren't quite real, and the way she uses that uncertainty to explore her relationship with this other person, who it's all shrouded in mystery. Kind of imagine it being in a garden at night. I think that's a really good poem for people to get into, because it's not you're going along with the poem, and you're not kind of expected to catch up with it.
Right.
Nice.
So going back to a poet that you mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that I know has been a constant influence in both your poetry and mine, was John Ashbery. Whenever I read your poetry, I can almost always find him there. And I feel like the same with my poetry. I can always see him when I'm trying to like tap into him when I'm writing. So that's a base influence that we have in common. Is there anything that's influencing your poetry now that maybe wasn't, say, like a year ago? And I know you just said like it's been a little hard to write, which is fair. Same for me.
The act of writing has been the trouble. Thinking about writing, or just kind of being in that space, that is still there. I think about writing every single day, and lines coming up, and I guess ideas. It's the final bit, which is the actual writing of it. That's kind of that's really interesting. I think it's funny because a lot of the things that I found really interesting and inspiring haven't always been kind of poets themselves. It's been kind of things that, I guess, like the New York School of Poetry, art was so integral to that movement. It was art feeds poetry, and then the poetry feeds the art. And I feel a lot like I've had that. And the things that I have been writing, have kind of, it's been more focused on like the immediate environment. Beforehand, I did lots of phonic phrases. That was really good, like Joseph Cornell. When I did my last portfolio, like he was a huge influence on his boxes, he constructed worlds inside of these boxes. That was, it was all about boxes and how poetry can fit inside and outside of spaces. I think it seems to me that the things that I'm enjoying it, because I can't really go anywhere or do anything, what is around me. For instance, the relationships I have with the people who I live with, or who I work with, or the like outside, like the
Mhm.
parks outside and the animals in there. And I think I never really paid that much attention to myself in relation to like the physical environment, and perhaps where my identity is in relation to that. And but like where I live in Newcastle, there's a lot of green space,
Mhm.
and like beautiful stretching, like the houses themselves are so amazing and really nice, like early, like late 1800s architecture. And I hadn't really thought about where I stand in relation to what's immediately around me.
Mhm.
Where I thought it's been, where do I stand in terms of my literary legacy that comes behind me, or in regards to like where does my work stand, where do I stand in regards to art movement. This is a far more immediate thing.
Mhm.
It's been quite
Yeah, that sounds really like intense, kind of, and like it's gonna lead to some really exciting stuff that you're gonna have to send me once you get there.
I've been watching a lot of film, and I've noticed how film is incredibly poetic. Been reading a lot of fiction, noticing, Italo Calvino, fucking so poetic, really beautiful. And it's kind of like I've been dancing around the actual medium itself, the poetry. And I don't know if that's because I've been out of it for so long, I'm nervous to come back to it. And so I'm kind of seeing poetry and everything else and poetry all around me, and not actually in that itself.
Yeah, no, that's funny that you say that, because I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm feeling the exact same way. I'm watching a lot of film as well. A lot of like, as much film as I can. Anything from like blockbusters to like, international art house films, whatever. And same thing. I'm finding a lot of poetry in them, and I'm feeling the same kind of intellectual engagement and the same kind of satisfaction in those that I am getting out of, or that I would get out of poetry. But I am finding, and with film has always been a big influence on my poetry, and like kind of translating those techniques onto the page. So I've been digging deeper into that. And I've got some, there's been fruit there. It's been a fruitful excavation. But I have had to find other ways of inspiring creativity from me, given the current situation. And that's one of the ways, I think, is reading other pieces of media as I am used to reading a poem.
I don't know if it's just one of those things that kind of, I guess, is all kind of art. It all feeds into each other. But I don't know really about poetry that kind of made me go, I'm not interested, can't do it. If it's just, it's kind of, it's intimidating. I don't, if it's like, say, I always think it's kind of like a friend that you've had an argument with, that you love intensely, and you know that you'll always be there for them, but at the moment it's kind of like, I don't know how to really like engage with this. It's
right.
so intensely familiar to me. But at the same time, almost kind of alien. And I don't know if that's finishing the MA, and being, once you finish university, you return to the womb. You kind of have this weird moment of being reborn, because you don't have that entire network, and everything that gave you creative justification, that's now gone. So you have to kind of re-find yourself, find new ground. And any of the work that I was going to try and do last year, the rug kind of got pulled out from under my feet, because instead of being able to focus on creative endeavors, I was instead just thinking about the fact that I was working a lot, and I wasn't working. I was at home staring at the wall. And also at this very point in my life, I didn't really know who I was anyway, and I was going to kind of move on and find my way through doing these creative things. And I certainly don't think it was for like a lack of trying. There were loads. I noticed there was a really, at least in the first lockdown, there was a really strong community of artists and creators and poets. But honestly, I just couldn't do it. kind of felt that imposter syndrome thing. I thought, well, I just can't do it. So I don't know. I think, and like you say, the film is like a big thing, and I don't know if it's because it's a visual art, or if it's maybe as if you were a filmmaker, you might feel the same thing about film, because it's not your craft, but it's a craft that you have a lot of respect for. Kind of lose yourself from that. I don't know. It's a bit of a funny one. I'm hoping China will be a new and exciting environment for that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it will too. That was one of my great inspirations before the lockdown, was travel, and very basically just interaction with new environments, with new concepts, with new pieces, whatever it may be, new people. So I'm very excited for you to go to China and see how that may trigger some inspiration in you. And you'll have to send me some of those poems from what will be your China era.
I will, and when you come and visit me, we can write them together.
Oh my God! Imagine collaborative Chinese-inspired poetry, Chinese experience-inspired poetry. Come on now.
I know. I'm very excited for it. Yeah, I think I do. Yeah, I think the travel thing is pretty spot on, really. I don't know if it's because we're so used to kind of having the external is the kind of reflection of the internal, and when you kind of need to go somewhere new, think about something, and we don't have that. So just kind of, I've just sort of focused on getting through the days rather than writing.
Yeah, which is fair, which is completely fair. You got to get through those days. But that relationship with the external and the internal is really interesting, because I've noticed with me, again, that there's, like I said, my major point of influence was experience with the external, everything external, and how it came through me and related to me. Now that I can't do that because of lockdown, I think I've resorted to purely internal, and I'm relying on, besides the films, as we just said, but I've resorted back to the internal, onto aspects of influence that were always present, but are now taking a much more prominent role in that process of inspiration, which are memory and dreams. So if I write anything these days, it's almost directly tied to a dream I had, trying to excavate the symbolism or whatever in that dream, or a memory that has incorporated it in some way for me to be able to expand on it in a way that I think would be efficient.
You should say that, because when I think about your poetry, there's the ones that always kind of seem strongest anyway were ones to do with memories and recalling. I can't remember the names of them. I'm so sorry. I can't remember the names of my own poems. But there's ones that hair,
yeah.
That struck me as like a series of kind of memories that were all very like tight. They all kind of followed on from the other, and they were all closely relate to one another. There was also one with your housemates in Durham, when you're taking a photo and they're all like dancing around you.
I don't remember that one.
Good one. There's the one about the rabbit. I like that one as well. But there's one, I think it's called like a day out. You've gone on a day out.
Yes.
That moment encapsulated in like the whole day, I guess, in your relationship with them has been encapsulated in this one moment. And it's funny because a lot of your poems they are intensely visual, and they are really like films. And I can imagine them as films. That's the way I visualize them. More it's like this kind of sensory experience, not just like the poem and then what's that? What's the image conjuring up? It's more than that, and I don't know if that's just because I also know you. But they're incredibly rich things, and I think maybe you're just quite drawn to that. I think the memory seems to be quite a strong thing, and out of it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm happy to hear that you see those influences that I'm working towards in my work. That particular poem, Day Out, is one I have not thought of in a while, obviously. But that one was written in a period, which I still kind of try to do, but especially when I wrote that a couple years ago, was very much me trying to reconcile what I thought were like two disparate styles of influence, which were the Imagists and I think like kind of New York schooly kind of
Yeah.
that kind of thing, which even though, they're all part of the long tradition of modernism, they are very different. And I was trying to like layer them on top of each other in some way. And I try to do that with a lot of my poetry, trying to layer different schools on top of one another. And then the film aspect too. So yeah, I think that's something that I'm always trying to do. So I'm glad you picked up on that. So everybody that we've talked about so far, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, has been white. So let's change it up a little bit. Do you have any poets of color that you've been into lately?
Yeah, Terrence Hayes.
Hmm.
If you've ever read any of his stuff, he's phenomenal. I think about my reading, and it's like you look at my bookshelf and it is uncomfortably white, and it's one of those things that I need to definitely explore more. But one of those poets has been Terrence Hayes. Like a lot of his stuff is almost performance poetry, which isn't usually something that I am interested in. And you read the books. Today I was reading How to Be Drawn, and you look at it and there's no real form. It's just kind of each line is another kind of bit. But you realise that as you're reading it, he's really motivated by sound. I was reading How to Be Drawn by Terrence Hayes today, and there's a poem in it called How to Draw a Perfect Circle. And I was reading it, and normally when I read a new poet, there's kind of a resistance if they're doing something outside of my interest. So for me, I think form comes before anything else when I'm writing a poem. And in his stuff, form just takes backseat. It's not really something that seems to be being played around with. And I was kind of reading it, and I was like, this kind of isn't working. And then it clicks, because as you're reading it and you're hearing it aloud, it's talking about how to draw a perfect circle, and the sounds and the lines and the images are also circular, and you realise it's forming in your head. That's the images, and it's one of those things. You listen to him speak, and he's like an orator. He's really evokes the tradition of like a bard, or people sitting around listening to one person tell these stories, and he mixes. He's like the perfect contemporary poet, because he mixes politics, like what it means to be a black man in America. Also, things that in some of the poems he references Frank O'Hara, like he embeds himself in a diverse literary tradition. He acknowledges John Ashbeal, like Frank O'Hara, like they're mentioned, but that for him, he's not for. And that's the trouble, I think, with some poetry, when everything you read is set so far behind, you run the risk of being stuck there. Outdate, but Terrence Hayes is fresh. He's talking about mythology. He's talking about poetry that you or I would know, but he's also mixing that with the now. What does it mean to have a different identity to everyone around you? How does that function? And the sounds, like the way that they trip out of your mouth as you say them, it's really pleasing, and you can tell that he just gets it. Really, really good stuff. And I would absolutely love to see him live. That's the thing, a lot of poetry, I'm not really interested in hearing it, but I think for him, he is to hear it and it's to be there.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. Like I haven't read any of his poetry, so I'm going to look into that. You touched on that thing of being influenced by a certain body of poetry and not being able to escape it, quote unquote. That's something that I'm constantly worried about. And I think I've expressed this to you before. As you know, a lot of my heroes are mid-century, older. Very rarely are they still alive. But somebody, a poet of color, who's also my favorite 21st century poet, just to answer another question from one of our followers, is I don't know if you are familiar with his work, but Tongo Eisen Martin. He was just named very recently, like last month, maybe, the poet laureate of San Francisco. Yeah, which is, quite a prestigious position in the world of poetry, and he's very embedded in the San Francisco tradition of poetry, which is, in my opinion, one of the richest traditions in the world for a city to have. His work is very much in line with the ideals of Sons and Daughters in the revolutionary aspects and the mid-century influence. It's very beat meets surreal meets speech patterns at resistance rallies, that kind of thing, which is very interesting. I feel like these two poets that we've talked about are kind of the two paths for which contemporary poetry can take and be effective and be exciting. One, the more kind of fiery, lively resistance poetry of Tongo, and the more intellectual kind of artistic path. Not saying that Tongo is not intellectual, because he very much reaches those heights too, but a little bit more pure artistic intellectuality in poems like How to Draw a Circle, or How to Draw a Perfect Circle.
I mean, I don't know. It would be really interesting to hear what you think about this, actually. The whole, is poetry becoming more and more a vehicle for protest or kind of activism, in a sense? When I think now, I mean, this is probably just because you think about like poetry now, or poetry that I've seen, it seems to be a really good way for people to, I guess, kind of craft their activism or their plight. I don't know if it's because it is more engaging than standing on a soapbox. But I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, funny you bring that up. I actually had somebody contact me through the website a couple of days ago asking a very similar question about involving their activism with their art. I think they're a visual artist, and I was talking to him about that. I do find that many people think it's effective to use poetry as a vessel for their own, like as their own mouthpiece, essentially. I personally am not a fan of that. When I'm reading something, it turns me off almost immediately when I can tell that the writer is using a character or a poem as a way to let you know what they think, the writer thinks.
Yeah.
I think that you're doing it a disservice. So the way that I try to do it, by avoiding that kind of mouthpiece technique, is to kind of draw on the imagists and just present things as they are. Present it as they are, and in a way that kind of maybe exposes an aspect of an oppressed population, or of a personal experience with oppression or resistance techniques, and work it into the poem in a way where it becomes just the fabric of the poem, rather than something that you're trying to show people in the poem. Does that make sense? So I think it requires a little bit of elevation of technique to get there, but I think it's possible for everybody. I think those are the most effective pieces of art that do it, when it's just a part of the very fabric of the creative process that gets to that end poem or end piece, whatever it may be.
No, I think that's probably quite a good way to approach it, really, and thinking about it. I think definitely when anybody's encountering a piece of art and you can tell that there's a barely concealed agenda with it,
Right.
it's kind of, it seems almost, I don't even want to say laughable, but it's just kind of like the reader isn't stupid. The reader can see.
Yeah.
Like a reader is far smarter and far more astute than I think people give them credit for, because they can tell immediately. They can tell immediately when someone knows what they're talking about, or if someone's absolutely bullshitting. Which I think a lot of people that did create writing courses don't realise, because maybe they're good at giving the course what it wants, but it won't give the reader what they want. And so I think people get like really askew ideas about how to approach, because most all poems have a message. It's the way in which you convey it.
Right.
And I think you're totally right. It needs to be kind of brought up. It needs to be, I can't even think what the word is, but it needs to be elevated in some sense.
I agree. I think the message of the poem should exist in the world of the poem, of the creation of the poem, rather than something that is told through the poem, if that makes sense. I do agree. I think there's, in a lot of ineffective art, there's an underestimating of the audience. And I think that's kind of the one of the results of that underestimation is that kind of, I have to tell them what I'm thinking. I have to tell them this is what's up. If I don't, nobody will. That kind of stuff, which isn't true. You can, I mean, you can find messages in the most dense of poetry, in the most hard to understand poetry, that's not, that's not just laid out before you. And I find that a much more rewarding experience when I'm reading a poem. And maybe I have to put in a little more work to find what the message is, or decode some stuff, but.
I do feel a bit like, I'd be interested, maybe you agree with this or maybe you don't, but I sometimes feel a bit like with writing, I'm a bit of a recovering modernist, because when I started so heavily in the Imagist tradition, mid-century modernism, I kind of like couldn't, like it was like the vortex in which all of my work got sucked into. Not to say that I don't think it's a beautiful movement, and I think some of the best poetry that I've ever encountered is in that, but I don't know. I say when you start writing in a genre like so heavily, it's really hard to get out of it, and it's really hard to kind of it becomes you don't you kind of put yourself in it. And I do think that the kind of writing that I'm going to move on to now, it will probably still pay dues to that, but it then needs to be that kind of progression. And I think like the contemporary poets that we've spoken about, two of which there are a countless number, those would be the kind of interesting poets that I think will drive writers.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that kind of getting out of that mid-century, early century modernism is something that I'm honestly still struggling with. I'm still trying to climb my way out of that. But like you said, I still love it, and most of my heroes are from that period and that kind of thing. But so earlier you said that whenever you encounter a poem that's doing something outside of your comfort level, your poetic comfort level, there's resistance there. That's interesting that you say that, because that is directly linked to my efforts to try to expand past that modernism vacuum that we've both been in before. And it's a difficult thing to push through, but there are so many, as you just said, so many contemporary poets doing great things that kind of touch on modernism, but are not beholden to it in a way that I feel like I am a lot of the time, like Tango or anybody else in that tradition as well. So I'm presently in the process of essentially collecting as many anthologies that encompass large swaths of voices as possible. For example, I just got an anthology, multiple anthologies. One is on Native Nations poetry, which is edited by Joy Harjo, which I'm excited to read. I got one on Chinese worker poets. That's pretty good. I got Japanese poetry at the Mid-Century Anthology, things like that, that are like really pushing me in ways that I have not yet been to before, but I am having to prep myself for what I know will be that resistance of me and my own limitation of seeing something that's not quite modernist and almost being offended that it's not quite as modernist as I would like it.
I don't know, you feel almost like you're a bit possessive of it. I think especially if it's something that you came to at like a formative time in your life, you'll always have that like intense emotional connection. But I do, it's one of those things that you have to break through, because otherwise you'll just be stuck reading the same 5 poets. And I think the idea of just buying anthologies is so good, and I think that's really good if anybody ever wants to get into poetry, to buy anthologies, because then you've got at your hand a fantastic resource that doesn't just show you different poets, how they might intersect, often these things have forewords as well or afterwards, and those again will lead you on path to new and exciting poets.
But yeah, I agree. I think that anthologies are an excellent way to introduce yourself to poetry in general or specific time periods, because there's an anthology for everything. There's anthologies for decades, for parts of centuries. There's anthologies for different demographics of poets, different styles, different schools. You can find almost any anthology covering anything you may be interested in. My one warning with anthologies, though, would have to be thinking about the anthology as an institution in terms of biases and limitations of who they include and why they include them. Just like any other type of like exclusionary institution, they're a good starting point, and you can get very rich discoveries out of them. I think once you do that, the next step to go a little bit deeper, if you so choose, would be to look at the poets whom were not included and find out why. For example, I'm a big fan of, again, talking about that intense emotional connection to modernism that I know we both have. A book that I would consider, if I had to, my like poetic Bible would be the New American Poetry Anthology, which is like, I did, didn't I? That's like, that changed my life, like straight up. I don't know that a book has ever changed my life in the same way that anthology did. And that, to me, that was like the be all end all of poetry. And all my favorite poets were in there, and some of their best work was in there. Loved it to death. The more research I did my master's thesis on that book. And the deeper I got into it, I actually got into some of the letters between Donald Allen, the editor, and people like Allen Ginsberg, and particularly the letters between Donald Allen and Robert Duncan, who did not want to be in the anthology. He did not want to do it. He's like, this is stupid. I don't want any part of this. This is going to damage poetry beyond belief. He is included in the anthology, and from there went on to become one of the greatest voices of mid-century modernism, in my opinion, one of the greatest voices in poetry ever. He's an ultimate for me. But it's interesting that he did not want to be included, because he knew this kind of effect that anthologies have on artistic communities if you're not included or if you are included. To complete this example, there's a poet named Stephen Jonas, who very recently City Lights put out a reader, I think a year or two ago, maybe. And he was around at the same time, at the mid-century. He was pals with Ginsberg and Duncan and Creeley and Olson, and he had heavy influence by Pound and William Carlos Williams. He was not included in the anthology and was promptly essentially forgotten because he was not a part of that anthology. So it's people like him that are at risk of being forgotten by being excluded from anthologies that I think we have to put extra effort into preserving, as the way City Lights is. With they just put out a book called Arcana that has a lot of his great poems in there. And even Ginsberg said he was like, I mean, Ginsberg has said this about a lot of people, but he said that Stephen Jonas was like one of the defining American poetic voices at the time, and for him to be forgotten is a poetic tragedy. So you know, that's just a roundabout way to say, keep that in mind while you're reading anthologies.
Yeah, right. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah,
Thanks, Tom.
yeah, of course. I'm happy to have you on.
That was really good.
Yeah.